Hi, this is Misha, and I'm going to talk about fantasy, some of the benchmark authors that you'll want to know about, and subgenres. And before I start, I just wanted to talk about how fantasy has been with us for a very, very long time. Brian Stableford, in his Historical Dictionary of Fantasy Literature, mentions that fantasy has been part of storytelling for as long as people have been telling stories. And he said that because fantasy is one of the more recent genres to have a marketing label, this isn't always recognized. He said that there have always been fantasy stories in the Chaucerian sense, tales of the strange and supernatural. Um, and he goes on to say that the stories that cultures possess before acquiring the faculty of writing and the stories that provide the foundations of literary culture when they do acquire it are almost all fantastic. Um, and they've been with us for as long as we've been telling stories. Like I mentioned, things like Arabian Nights has elements of the fantastic, Epic of Gilgamesh. But where we really see fantasy taking part in written literature early is the 15th century, when Thomas Malory's Arthurian novel Faerie Queene by Edmund Spenser um, became popularized. And shortly after these books became big, there entered a period in the 18th century when writers like Defoe and Richardson and Fielding, very realistic writers, became the thing, and these kinds of books weren't being written as much or read as much. And so it's really in the 19th century that we start to see what we now know as modern fantasy. George MacDonald was one of the earlier writers in this time. He was very influential. He wrote what was considered basically the first fantasy written for adults, Fantasies, which came out in 1958. And C.S. Lewis credits him as an influence. He says, I knew I had crossed a great frontier. He picked up the book in a train book stall, and it changed his life and certainly influenced the writing he did. And one of the things I like to share, one of the way I got introduced to George MacDonald is I was helping a reader, and she said she wanted something fantastic that would just take her out of her stresses in life. And she mentioned that she liked George MacDonald. And I will confess, even though I'd been doing Reader's Advisory for a while, I hadn't been reading that much fantasy at that time. And I suggested the first fantasy author I could think of that I had read, which was Philip Pullman. And it wasn't until after the fact that she gave me some signs, and also I read more about George MacDonald. He's a Christian author, and Philip Pullman has done everything he can to make sure everyone knows he is not a Christian author. He is the opposite of that. And so I still think about that with pangs, about a Reader's Advisory fail, that I failed that reader in that moment, but I learned from it. You're going to have moments like that too, where the political or the belief systems of an author are very important to that author and to that reader. And unless they tell you, you may not always know what those are if you're not aware of that writer. But George MacDonald was a huge figure in fantasy history. And then we start to come into, fantasy for children was definitely starting to come forward. We've got people like, Lewis Carroll, J.M. Barrie, L. Frank Baum. And it was around this time, too, that you started to get more fantasy and science fiction. For older readers, there are magazines like Weird Tales that started in 1923, The Unknown that started in 1939, and the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction that started in 1949. And many of these magazines launched the careers of authors we still read and talk about today, like H.P. Lovecraft and Ray Bradbury. And in 1937, The Hobbit came out, and that's really sort of the beginning of the popularity of the fantasy that we see now. 1938, The Sword and the Stone. 1950, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So, and then in the 1950s, this is when the Fellowship of the Ring trilogy came out. And around the same time that these came out, Paul Anderson's The Broken Sword was released. It's a very dark fantasy, more violent, more sexuality being explored. It's almost more. One of the things that Jared has mentioned is that if this had become the popular book of that time, instead of Tolkien, we'd see a very different kind of fantasy. earlier in fantasy. We're seeing it now. We're seeing darker, grimmer fantasy than we were seeing because of Tolkien's influence for many years, and because of what readership was ready for and what was popular. And I just wanted to play a clip of Lev Grossman talking about fantasy, because I think he speaks very eloquently about why is fantasy popular now? Why are readers going to fantasy more than ever before? So I will let him speak.
Towards the end of the 20th century, all of the reigning kind of pop culture franchises tended to be science fiction. They tended to be Star Wars or Star Trek or The Matrix, The X-Files. Just around the turn of the millennium, that changed. And the first harbinger of it was Harry Potter. But then we became obsessed with The Lord of the Rings, and Twilight, Narnia, True Blood. We, as a culture, started asking questions that science fiction wasn't so good at answering. And these were questions that didn't have to do with maybe technology or the future or space or aliens. We needed something else to help us answer or at least ask those questions. And that something else turned out to be fantasy. We needed to think about magic, for lack of a better world, but also about the natural world and about the past. Those are the preoccupations of fantasy, and right now those seem to be our preoccupations.
You mean like climate change and geopolitical wars?
Yes, I mean, when you look at where modern fantasy began, it began with a lot of people, but principally Tolkien and Lewis, writing in the 20s and 30s. And it's very interesting to see where these guys came from. Tolkien and Lewis, both combat veterans of World War I. They were both fighting at the Somme. And that generation presided over the complete destruction of the world that it knew as children. Those people saw the electrification of cities. They saw the horse replaced by the automobile. They saw the rise of mass media. Saw the rise of psychoanalysis and mechanized warfare. The world that they lived in looked nothing like the world of their childhood. And this kind of trauma that they lived through was what gave birth, I think, to fantasy, which is a literature of longing, a longing for things that are lost, things in the past or wherever you locate them. And I think that we right now are in a similar position. We live in a world that has been radically transformed and does not closely resemble the world we grew up in. And I think that fantasy is a way of, for us, of trying to make sense of that and trying to understand what we lost.
So I feel like Lev Grossman just really captures a lot of great thinking about why is fantasy so popular now. And one of the things that this course, I think, has hit on in a number of ways, both through your reading, through some of the talks that others have given, is just that there is often this sort of disdain or distrust or discrediting of popular fiction, of genres. And I still remember it was at Locus Awards a couple of years ago. I saw Kim Stanley Robinson on a panel of authors, and I asked him why he thought maybe fantasy and science fiction weren't being taught, or why they weren't being respected well enough. And he said, well, actually, that's not true. We've won. Science fiction and fantasy has infiltrated all literature, and it's now becoming more accepted. And I just wanted to share the words of Ursula K. Le Guin. Just recently, Neil Gaiman introduced her and presented the 2014 Medal for Distinguished Contribution for American Letters at the National Book Awards. And here is what Le Guin said when she accepted the award. She said she is accepting the award for and sharing it with all the writers who were excluded from literature for so long, my fellow authors of science fiction and fantasy, writers of the imagination, who for the last 50 years watching the beautiful awards go to so-called realists. So there's been this real dichotomy between the respect that fantasy and science fiction and many other genres get, as opposed to, quote, realism. which, depending on the books you're looking at, are they really real? um, but all very fascinating fodder. But for the most part, just the thing to know is that you're going to get a lot of readers who are wanting fantasy. And here's what you want to know. The main appeals, there's just so many appeals of fantasy because the genre is as varied as any other. Our setting and world building is one of the things you'll hear a lot in terms of science fiction and fantasy. Character, human and otherwise. Story, many readers are going to want a strong story doorway here. And really, the key themes that fantasy explores is the battle between good and evil. A journey or a quest is usually central to any fantasy discovery and triumph. And Grossman pointed out very well, I think, how it speaks to our times, how it speaks to the things that realistic fiction just don't give us. It helps us see our times by helping us see beyond them. So one of the major subgenres of fantasy is epic fantasy. And there's no real one definition of this really, other than epic tends to be just the world building is more complex. There is usually a larger cast of characters. It's something that is all absorbing, all encompassing. They're just basically really meaty doorstop types of fantasies. And Robert Jordan is considered one of the major authors in this genre. His Wheel of Time books are 14 in the series, plus a prequel. They were finished by Brandon Sanderson when Robert Jordan died. He's another epic fantasy author to keep in mind. But what happened with Jordan and that he wasn't able to finish his series himself is one of the reasons that people keep bugging George R.R. Martin. He's getting on, and people are worried that he's not going to finish his Song of Ice and Fire series before he dies. The Wheel of Time features 3 young men who set off on a journey in the heroic fantasy tradition with the evil one at their heels. Terry Brooks is a Washington author. He started the original Shannara series in 1977. There have been numerous spin-offs and trilogies and series in the world, replete with elves and other creatures. The Sword of Shannara is set in a post-apocalyptic Earth, very Tolkien-inspired. But here's what Brooks said about that. He said, "I would set my adventure story in an imaginary world, a vast, sprawling, mythical world like that of Tolkien, filled with magic that was replaced science and races that had evolved from man. But I was not Tolkien and did not share his background in academia or his interest in cultural study, so I would eliminate the poetry and songs, the digressions on the ways and habits of types of characters, and the appendices of language and backstory that characterized and informed Tolkien's work. I would write the sort of straightforward adventure story that barreled ahead, picking up speed as it went, compelling a turning of pages until there were no more pages to be turned." So that gives you a sense of the kind of fantasy that Brooks is writing. He's writing in that Tolkien tradition, but with less digression, more action, more forward motion. Terry Goodkind is another major epic fantasy author to know about. He's written a number of high epic fantasy trilogies like Otherland and Shadow March. Oh goodness, I got that mixed up. Terry Goodkind has written The Sword of Truth, Perilous Quest. This is what happens when you have too many Terrys. And Only One Man, Richard Cipher, Can Save the Kingdom. Tad Williams is the author of the Otherland and Shadowmark trilogies. Robin Hobb is another Washington State fantasy writer. And she has written a number of trilogies, some of them linked. Assassin's Apprentice is fantasy with high political intrigue, featuring a young man who discovers a lot of things about his kingdom and has to go on to try and save it. She's got The Mad Ship and The Green Wilds Chronicles. She's definitely one for someone who enjoys political intrigue and great world building. And George R.R. Martin, who at this point needs no introduction and has sort of heralded in a new era of fantasy readers. I can't tell you how many times I've been seeing people on the bus reading these books who I think otherwise would not have been reading these books. So He's done very well with his bloody, violent, action-packed series, and the TV series has been doing really, really well. I will also note that he wrote a really great vampire novel called Fever Dream, set on the Mississippi steamboats in the 1800s. Great, really love that one. Patrick Rothfuss hit the scene with his debut, The Name of the Wind, which is epic fantasy and storytelling, and a little slower than something like Martin, a little more leisurely in its storytelling, but just wonderful. He's gotten to be quite a big name to know about, more classical in his storytelling techniques. And there is a magic school at the heart of these books, so it kind of appeals to the Harry Potter grown-up kind of fan. And I sort of can't get away without mentioning Neil Gaiman. Neil is kind of the reigning rock star of the fantasy world. He was born in 1960 in England and grew up reading fantasy, and he was turned on to comics in the 1980s by Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. He started his career writing comics. He wrote the Sandman comics, which feature immortal figures such as Dream and Death, which has earned him a solid reputation as a skillful weaver of magical and sometimes dark tales. Gaiman entered the world of novels with Good Omens, which he co-authored with Terry Pratchett, followed by Neverwhere, an urban fantasy set in the London Underground. There's been a television series and radio plays made based on Neverwhere. And in 2009, he won the Newbery Award for the Graveyard Book. As an anthologist, he works to promote other fantastical writers, and he often sings the praises of libraries. One of the things he said at a speech he gave in 2013 is, "I'm going to tell you that libraries are important. I'm going to suggest that reading fiction, that reading for pleasure, is one of the most important things one can do. I'm going to make an impassioned plea for people to understand what libraries and librarians are, and to preserve both of these things." That speech is worth reading in its entirety, and you can find it on the Guardian website. But what I want to mention as well is that one of the things that more readers are demanding and that the genre needs more of is diversity. So while it's not moving fast enough, there are quite a few authors to keep in mind for readers who are wanting non-European fantasy, because the predominant fantasy is set in, medieval or very European settings. So you've got people like Detroit author Saladin Ahmed with The Throne of the Crescent Moon, who sets his works in non-specific Arab countries. Seattle author G. Willow Wilson's Alif the Unseen, which is also set in a Middle Eastern country and is about a computer hacker. She's also been writing the Ms. Marvel comics featuring a Muslim American female heroine. And then you've got N.K. Jemisin, who's writing fantasy in the tradition of Octavia Butler, featuring women of color, strong women, and complex worlds. Another major subgenre in fantasy is time slip or time travel fantasy. Something like, H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, Time and Again by Jack Finney. It's, looking at the past through the eyes of today. You've also got books like Doomsday Book and Blackout All Clear, or by Connie Willis, or Kindred by Octavia Butler, that fit into this genre. Kindred is about a woman who goes back, who's an African-American woman in the 1970s in America, who goes back into the time of her ancestors, into slavery, and understands race politics in a new and different way from that experience. And then Connie Willis has gone on to do lots of these kind of stories where it's historians going back in time. Doomsday Book, I think, is her most powerful. And I don't want to give too much of that one away. It's just really, really wonderful. And Blackout and its sequel, All Clear, explores World War II. She does a lot of research for these, and so they actually are a good suggestion for people who enjoy historical fiction as well. Animal fantasy is a part of the appeal of fantasy itself. You've got things like Watership Down by Richard Adams, told from the perspective of rabbits. Joe Walton who's written a number of things. Tooth and Claw is sort of her Austen-esque fantasy. Very, very witty and could appeal to someone who doesn't necessarily read fantasy. But dragons are just a huge draw. Naomi Novik's Temeraire series, which starts with His Majesty's Dragon, features dragons during the Napoleonic Wars. And fairy tale fantasy. I mentioned Neil Gaiman before. He's someone who likes to do some of this. But we've got these sort of twisted fairy tales or retelling of fairy tales that have been very popular. Margot Lanigan's Tender Morsels, Joan Vinge's The Snow Queen, Tanith Lee definitely does darker, edgier retellings of fairy tales. And humor. Some people want fantasy that really gets them out of themselves, it really makes them laugh. Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman's Good Omens. Terry Pratchett has written numerous works in his Discworld series and has earned popularity for his ability to... He weaves a lot of politics and wittiness into all his stories. Someone who's less well known, another British comic fantasy author, is Tom Holt. And there's Robert Asprin. There are quite a few more, but these are some of the big ones to know about. And urban fantasy. Urban fantasy is dark and gloomy. It's set in urban settings. You've got things like Jim Butcher's Dresden Files. There's a little bit of that noir aspect to it. J.A. Pitts, who's a Washington author. What's nice about urban fantasy is it tends to often feature strong female characters. Another book I'll mention is The Rook by Daniel O'Malley, which is a very fun, fast-paced urban fantasy. And dark fantasy is sort of, it's where fantasy intersects with horror. Some of it becomes just downright horror. Some of Tanya Huff is in that. But things that feature vampires or from a monster's point of view, or really also anti-heroes. Stephen R. Donaldson's Chronicles of Thomas Covenant feature one of fantasy's most well-known anti-heroes. Anne Rice sort of fits into this with the vampire series, even though they don't tend to get shelved in fantasy and science fiction. But dark fantasy just has a lot more grimness to it. And then there's the genre that is not a genre, which is slipstream. And this is really where, as Kim Stanley Robinson said before, we've infiltrated everything. We are a part. Science fiction and fantasy is a part of all literature now. You're seeing some of these elements of fantasy and the fantastic, or what is now called slipstream, enter into a lot of things. You've got Haruki Murakami, Japanese cult favorite author who does a lot of surreal aspects to his work. Jeff Vandermeer, who's been kind of championing what he calls the new weird. He put out this trilogy, Annihilation. Annihilation is the first of the Southern Reach trilogy, and he's put out an entire trilogy in a year, which is pretty brilliant. And Kelly Link, who writes these really dark, strange stories, who's also got a new book coming out. And really, as David said in his speech, it all overlaps. So many of these genres are mashups. Jasper Ford's The Air Affair is fantasy and mystery and more, and then The Rook is sort of horror and urban fantasy, and Robert Silverberg's Madripoor books are a mix of science fiction and fantasy. So there's a lot of overlap. And some readers read only fantasy, some only read science fiction, and some read both, and so they're going to be open to more of these genre blends. And how to find out about more authors, more books, to stay on top of it, I really suggest a weekly or monthly diet of just looking at blogs, both looking at Early Word, which is a site for librarians to keep up on what's being made into film, but for the science fiction and fantasy genres, Tor.com. Tor is a publisher, but the site itself actually promotes all kinds of books. There are original stories, rereads, extensive rereads of certain books, which I have found very helpful for my book group. And IO9 just revels in science fiction and fantasy and pop culture. These are good places just to stop periodically to find out who's new, what are people talking about, what's being made into film, because chances are that's what people are going to be asking for and wanting you to know about. So thank you.